An 8-year-old girl's simple inquiry silenced a crowded town hall and left Donald Trump sharing a deeply personal story about spirituality, loss, and redemption. What happened next moved everyone to weep. Before we dive in, I'd like to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to our channel, and if you enjoy this video, please consider liking and sharing it. May God bless all those who support us, and may He continue to guide us in spreading kindness and hope. The church fellowship hall in Shreveport, Louisiana buzzed softly with the sound of folding chairs scraping against the polished floor and murmured dialogues. The space, usually reserved for Sunday potlucks and Bible study, had taken on an extraordinary air that evening. At the front of the room stood Donald Trump, his unmistakable presence filling the modest hall. His orange-tinted complexion and signature hand gestures were familiar to everyone, but tonight he was unusually subdued, perhaps sensing the gravity of the event. The audience was a mix of families, retirees, and local residents curious to hear what he had to say. But among the crowd there was one figure who seemed out of place, not because of her size, but because of her quiet determination. 8-year-old Lily, dressed in her best Sunday dress, clutched an old leather-bound Bible to her chest. It was a treasure passed down from her late grandmother, its pages worn and its gold lettering faded. Her mother, seated beside her, had whispered before they arrived, "You can ask him, but only if you're courageous enough and only if you truly mean it." Lily had nodded, her heart racing in her chest. She had been rehearsing her question for weeks, scribbling it out in her notebook during recess and murmuring it to herself as she lay in bed at night. It wasn't a question born from childish curiosity, but one that burdened her soul.
As the evening progressed, Trump spoke about his usual topics: policies, achievements, and the future of America. The crowd occasionally clapped or nodded in agreement, but the energy was lukewarm compared to his usual rallies. Lily waited, her small hands gripping the edges of her Bible tighter with each passing minute. Finally, the floor opened for questions. A line quickly formed with adults eagerly stepping forward to ask about local issues, national policies, and even a few compliments about his iconic red tie. Lily hesitated, her tiny frame shrinking further into her seat. But when her mother gave her a subtle push, she knew it was her moment. Her legs felt unsteady as she stood, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the entire room could hear it. The line seemed endless, but as she inched forward, the room's chatter began to dissolve. People noticed Hertha, small girl with the oversized Bible clutched tightly to her chest. Whispers rippled through the crowd. When her turn came, Trump looked down at her, his expression momentarily softening. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice surprisingly tender. Lily swallowed hard, gripping her Bible so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, with a voice that trembled but refused to break, she asked the question that had been echoing in her heart for months. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The room fell into an immediate and complete silence, eyes darting between the girl and Trump, the weight of her question pressing down on everyone like a tangible force. For a man known for his quick-witted answers, Trump didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her, then at the Bible in her hands, and something in his demeanor transformed. But before he could speak, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier with expectation, drawing everyone to the edge of their seats. Trump's silence was almost overwhelming. For a man who had built his career on sharp retorts and unwavering confidence, this pause felt peculiar. He stared at Lily for a long moment, his usual bravado replaced by something gentler, almost tender. The Bible she held caught his eye again, and his lips parted, but no words emerged. Lily shifted slightly, her small frame appearing even more delicate under the room's collective focus. Her question had not been intended to confront or incite it, had been genuine, born from a profound longing to grasp something bigger than herself. Somehow, that authenticity was louder than any political argument or shouted slogan. The crowd stayed silent. Even the creaking of chairs or a muffled cough seemed to disappear, as though the very room was holding its breath. Trump finally raised his hand slightly, as if to compose himself, and leaned against the podium. "That's a significant question," he began, his voice lower and calmer than usual. "And it's not one I've always had the solution to." The confession startled many. Trump, known for his unshakable confidence, was admitting uncertainty in front of a crowd. He looked back at Lily, and his expression changed again, this time to something almost fatherly. "When I was about your age," he continued, "I had plenty of questions about God too. My parents would take me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those pews, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even listening to me." He paused again, this time glancing out at the audience as if gauging their reaction. His hand rested on the edge of the podium, fingers lightly tapping the wood. "My father used to tell me," he went on, that faith is like a ladder, you climb it one step at a time. And sometimes you're scared you'll fall, but you keep climbing because there's something up there worth reaching for. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet. A faint chuckle rippled through the audience, easing the tension slightly. Lily, however, didn't smile. Her eyes stayed locked on him, waiting for the authentic answer she had sought. Trump leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming even gentler. But as I got older, life threw a lot of trials my way. I faced losses, failures, and moments where I wasn't sure if I could keep going. During those times, I didn't always feel like God was with me. Sometimes I was angry at him. Other times, I thought maybe he'd given up on me entirely. The room remained spellbound. This wasn't the usual polished rhetoric or rehearsed lines they were accustomed to. This was something raw, something unfiltered. But I'll tell you this, Trump said, his voice gaining strength again. Even in my darkest moments, when I thought I was alone, I realized that faith isn't about always having the answers. It's about trusting that even when you don't see the entire picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work. He glanced back at Lily, whose grip on the Bible had loosened slightly. Her wide eyes shimmered under the fluorescent lights. And God, to me, he said slowly, is that meaning. He's the reminder that even when we stumble, even when we falter, we're not finished. He's the one who keeps urging us to climb the ladder, even when it feels like it's about to collapse. But before the weight of his words could fully sink in, Lily's eyes welled up with tears. And the crowd began murmuring softly, sensing that something remarkable was happening. Lily's tears came quietly at first, a single drop sliding down her cheek as she clutched her grandmother's Bible tighter against her chest. But then, as Trump's words lingered in the air, her shoulders began to shake. The crowd noticed their whispers growing louder, yet no one dared to interrupt the moment. Her mother leaned over instinctively, placing a comforting hand on her back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered softly, but Lily shook her head. This wasn't sadness, it was something far profounder. Trump had spoken words she hadn't known she needed to hear, and in doing so, he had touched a part of her young heart she had long protected. Trump seemed to notice her reaction and took a step away from the podium, his face unusually composed. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lily," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's a lovely name," he said with a faint smile. "You know, Lily, sometimes the most straightforward questions are the hardest ones to answer. And sometimes, those questions remind us of what truly matters." Lily nodded, her tear-filled eyes never leaving his. "My grandma used to say that too," she said softly. "She said God is always listening, even when you don't hear him." Trump's expression flickered with something unspoken, a mix of admiration and understanding. He took a deep breath, turning his attention back to the crowd. "You know," he began, "this little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask. What does God mean to us?" It's not an easy question because it forces us to look inward. It makes us confront our fears, our uncertainties, and our imperfections. The room was utterly silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. For a moment, it felt as though Lily wasn't just a little girl with a Bible. She was a representation of something much greater. Her courage had shifted the tone of the entire evening, transforming it from a routine town hall into a deeply personal reflection on faith and humanity. Trump continued, his voice steady but gentler than before. "We live in a world where we're always searching for answers outside of ourselves. We think power, achievement, or wealth will fill the void. But they don't. The real answers are the ones that challenge us, the ones that make us uncomfortable. They're the questions that make us ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is watching?" He paused, his gaze returning to Lily. "Thank you for reminding me of that, Lily. You're wiser than most adults I know." The crowd erupted into soft applause, but Lily didn't seem to notice. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a look of quiet pride. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress. She looked up at her mother, who smiled back at her with moist eyes of her own. But as the applause subsided, Trump's tone shifted once more, suggesting that this dialogue was far from over, and that the room was about to be drawn even deeper into his story. The room grew quieter still, as though the very air was waiting for Trump's next words. He adjusted slightly at the podium, his gaze scanning the audience before settling back on Lily. There was a gravity in his expression, a depth that seemed to stem from somewhere beyond politics or public life. "When I was a young man," Trump began, his voice gentler now, "there was a time I thought I had everything figured out. I had ambition, plans, and the determination to succeed. But there was one moment in my life, just one, that made me realize how little control I really had." He paused, allowing the words to settle. The crowd leaned forward, their interest tangible. Trump rarely offered a glimpse into his personal life, and now it seemed he was about to. "My brother Fred," he continued. "He was one of the kindest, most sincere people I've ever known. He had a light about him, a goodness that I couldn't fully grasp at the time. But Fred had his battles, his own struggles, and, no matter how much my family and I tried to help, it wasn't enough. Trump's voice hesitated briefly, and he cleared his throat. When he passed away, I was furious. Furious at him, furious at myself, and furious at God. I couldn't comprehend why someone so good, someone with so much promise, had to leave this world so soon. Lily's gaze stayed fixed on him, her young face carrying an expression far too insightful for her age. Around the room, others looked equally riveted, their faces reflecting a mix of empathy and curiosity. For a long time after that, Trump continued, I turned away from God. I thought, if he's real, why would he allow this? Why would he take someone like Fred and leave me behind? He exhaled heavily, his hand gripping the edge of the podium. But then something shifted. I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night I saw Fred's face in my mind. He was smiling, this big, silly smile he used to have on. I heard him say, don't be mad. Don, you've got work to do. The crowd remained silent, the weightiness of his words settling over them like a physical force. Even the faint sound of cars passing outside seemed to disappear, leaving only Trump's voice and the quiet rhythm of beating hearts. I realized then, he said, his voice steadying, that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about believing there's a purpose, even when you can't see it. And maybe, just maybe, Fred's purpose was to teach me that. He turned back to Lily, his expression softening. So when you ask me what God means to me, I'll say this. He's the reason I keep moving forward, even when it's difficult. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves, and he's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest hours. Lily's eyes gleamed again, but this time her tears didn't fall. Instead, she stood a little taller, holding her grandmother's Bible with both hands as though it were the most cherished thing in the world. But just as the room seemed to settle into the weight of his story, someone in the audience raised their hand, breaking the silence and redirecting everyone's focus. A man near the back of the hall stood slowly, his hand still lifted. His rugged face, lined with years of hard work, carried a serious expression. He was the kind of person you might pass by on the street without a second glance. A mechanic. A father, perhaps someone who attended church intermittently when life allowed. His voice, however, cut through the stillness like a bell. Mr. Trump, he said, his words measured and deliberate. I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder if all of us have been too afraid to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem? The question seemed to momentarily catch Trump off guard, but he didn't pause for long. He leaned slightly on the podium, his gaze locking onto the man's. You know, he began, I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want others to believe we are. Faith isn't easy, it's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're shouting into the void. But the truth is, that's exactly what makes it so powerful. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when you don't have all the answers. The man nodded, his serious expression softening as he sat back down. A ripple of murmured agreement spread through the crowd, but it was Lily's small, clear voice that broke through next. My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds, she said, her words steady despite her diminutive frame. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will. Trump smiled, a genuine, almost tender expression that seemed to soften his usual guarded demeanor. Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman, he said warmly, and she's right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout in the ways you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing in ways you can't see. The conversation seemed to breathe new energy into the room. People began nodding, exchanging glances, and whispering quietly to those beside them. What had begun as a structured town hall had evolved into something deeply personal, collective reflection on life's hardships, uncertainties, and moments of grace. An older woman, her silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, raised her hand next. I lost my husband last year, she said, her voice trembling. I've been so angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again? Trump stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice calm but resolute. It's never too late, he said. Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you. And sometimes, it's in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, that it finds its way back to you. The woman nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. Around the room, others appeared equally moved, some dabbing at their cheeks with tissues, others sitting silently in reflection. But as Trump's words settled into the hearts of those present, it became evident that the evening wasn't just about the questions being asked and answers anymore. It was about connection, and what came next would only strengthen that bond. The room felt electric now, not with noise, but with the tangible energy of shared vulnerability. People who had come, expecting a standard political talk, were instead part of something profoundly personal. It was as if Lily's simple question had opened a door that no one had dared approach before, and now no one wanted to retreat. Trump straightened his gaze, sweeping the room. You know, he said, there's something I've learned over the years. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small ones, the times when someone offers a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those moments remind us of what counts. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Trump's voice, so often commanding and unyielding, now carried a humility that struck a chord. He gestured toward Lily. This little girl reminded me tonight that faith isn't just something we talk about, it's something we live, and when we live it, it spreads. At that, Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks still flushed from earlier. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something in her ear that made the girl's smile widen just a bit more. Trump's tone grew firmer. We're living in a time when it feels like the world is pulling us apart: politics, opinions, differences. But faith has the power to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing that same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how distinct our paths look. A ripple of applause began, slow at first, but gaining momentum. People stood, clapping, not just for Trump, but for the moment itself. For the courage it had taken Lily to ask her question, and for the responses it had drawn out of everyone in the room. As the applause subsided, Trump leaned in one last time. So tonight, I'll leave you with this. Ask yourselves what faith means to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be. Because faith isn't about knowing. It's about believing. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before adding, and if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it, let it grow, and share it with the people who need it most. The room erupted in applause again, but this time it was punctuated with hugs, handshakes, and even a few tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with little more than polite nods now lingered, exchanging smiles and stories. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by a quiet hope. Lily, now standing with her mother, watched Trump step away from the podium. He walked over to her, kneeling slightly so they were eye to eye. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." She nodded, her small hand extending to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now. For answering, Trump stood, giving her a faint smile before turning back to wave at the crowd. As he exited, the room remained alive with chatter, the people clearly changed by what had just unfolded. Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she? Her mother smiled, tears welling in her eyes. She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been astonished. As the hall slowly emptied, lingering message was clear. Sometimes the boldest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find the pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing. If this story moved your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own faith and share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.